As the Revolutionary War began, both sides quickly started taking prisoners. In some cases, large numbers of prisoners that had to be housed, guarded, and administered to. What was the process for prisoner administration during the Revolutionary War? How did political motivations affect the treatment of prisoners? And how did prisoner management change during the war and influence modern prisoner care? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the administration of prisoners during the American Revolution. And joining me for this discussion is Army historian Dr. Susan Brynne Long. So welcome, Brynne.
Thank you so much, Lee. It's great to be here.
Yes, thanks. Welcome back. I know you've been a guest with us before, and I'm really looking forward to this topic. It's something I've never really considered. You know, you hear about prisoners of war, throughout all the wars, but specifically here during the Revolution, and you never consider, what went into keeping them. So before we get into the topic, let me just introduce everybody to who you are and what your background is. So Dr. Susan Brynne Long is the 2024-2025 Charles Young Fellow at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. Her current monograph project is on American prisoner administration in the Revolutionary War. So, this is a perfect topic for you. Previously, she has taught at the University of Delaware on colonial and revolutionary America and American military history. But she is now teaching history at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. So that's great. Doing what you love. I could see that, your passion teaching, especially in the colonial era. And, as mentioned, you've got your monograph project right on this topic. So let's just jump into it. How did prisoner administration work during the American Revolution and in the broader framework of colonial America or, early modern Europe?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, to your point that you made earlier, Lee, it's not really something that I thought about much either when I was starting my doctoral work, how are prisoners administered during the Revolution? And then as you start to get into it, you realize there is this broader history. So just, 30,000-foot glimpse of how this worked and sort of the influences on American and British prisoner administration during the Revolution. In the colonial period, in the British example, we see that the Sick and Hurt Board actually were responsible for prisoners within the British context. So this is true in the War of Spanish Succession, the War of the 7 Years' War, and those prisoners would be, again, administered by that board and held in a variety of places, so jails, but also in converted buildings and in barracks. Officers would be held in country homes sometimes. For the Americans, in terms of the way that they were seeing precedent for prisoner administration, that really mostly happens during the 7 Years' War. The Americans themselves did not have a lot of experience, settlers, colonial Americans did not have a lot of experience with dealing with prisoners until we get to the 7 Years' War. And it's during the 7 Years' War that there is a little bit of interaction between sort of provincials, as they would have been known during that conflict, or settler Americans and prisoners. For the most part, during the 7 Years' War, if you get to the end of a battle, those prisoners will be immediately exchanged, and so you give mine back, and I'll give yours back, essentially. And those prisoners will be sent home under various peace treaties. If there were sufficient numbers of prisoners, essentially, to make that exchange. But once you start to see the French losing ground in the 7 Years' War, of course, the balance is going to change, where the French will have, the British, rather, will have more prisoners than the French. And so exchange is not possible at that point. And so when that occurs, then we do see the prisoners will be sent back across the Atlantic to be put, again, in prisons in England. some isolated instances where prisoners will be hosted actually in the colonies during the 7 Years' War, largely in the mid-Atlantic. So, for example, after the fall of Quebec, there's going to be some French prisoners who are hosted locally in the colonies after the Battle of Lake George. We also see some prisoners staying in the colonies rather than being sent back to England. So the broader sort of traditions that the Americans are seeing during the late early modern period are largely focused on exchange and trying to sort of get those prisoners back home as soon as possible, even if that is under the stipulation that they can't return to the present conflict, for example, which did happen.
And did they hold to that?
Yeah, absolutely. When possible, because we're post the military revolution at this point. We're post this era of just sort of using them as fodder. So the idea that I'm trying to emphasize here is that soldiers are very valuable. It's important to get them back, and if they can't be returned again due to that sort of balancing problem of exchange, treat them humanely. And make sure that these men are not being subjected to forced labor, for example. Make sure that they're rationed, largely in prison. And this varies from peace treaty to peace treaty, but are generally 2/3 weekly ration will still be given to those soldiers. And then the work that's all being paid for is that the belligerents will either pay for their prisoners up front, or there will be this reimbursement after the war is over. So we're making sure, there are all these sort of rules that have come up really since the end of the 30 Years' War that says we need to acknowledge that, prisoners are valuable, that soldiers are valuable, they should be treated well if they need to be held in captivity, though, of course, exchange is always the focus. So in the colonial context, again, those prisoners that did end up being hosted locally, they would have been occasionally hired out for their services sometimes to sort of supplement the cost of their rations, because it all sounds well and good on paper that a belligerent will repay you for a soldier's rations while he is in captivity. But in reality, the manifestation of those sorts of reimbursements is sort of tenuous, particularly once the French are losing money and the French government is becoming bankrupt. That's going to become less of a sure thing. So the hiring out system does have a little bit of precedence in the colonial period. And yeah, again, just exchange them if you can, and if you can't, then make sure they're treated well in captivity. And being treated well is going to take a variety of different forms during both the colonial period and the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of these peace treaties. So, today we follow the Geneva Convention. I think the Third Geneva Convention is what's in effect now. So were these individual peace treaties between different countries, or was there a governing body like the Geneva Convention that we follow today?
Great question. So I'm talking about, direct conventions or treaties signed between countries, at the conclusion of various engagements. So there is a treaty, for example, that's signed by Britain and France during the 7 Years' War. It's called the Treaty of Exilles or Sluis. There's different pronunciations, so I'm sorry for anybody who knows how to pronounce that correctly. But this is one, for example, that says that Britain will return French prisoners to France, or as soon as possible. This exchange will happen as soon as possible at the end of these engagements. Now, as I said, we have things that look good on paper, such as exchange of prisoners ASAP, but this is much more difficult to implement once you start thinking about the distance that's involved with that, the personnel that's involved with transporting large numbers of prisoners across the Atlantic. Some of these prisoners are fighting in very inland locations, so we're also talking about overland transportation as well as the difficulty of crossing the Atlantic. And so, yeah, just to get back to your question, it's not a formal set of rules that's written down that every, Western European or Atlantic country power is looking at and saying we need to treat prisoners according to these standards. This is more of a sort of a body of guidelines that exist across multiple different agreements that are made between powers, and it's emerging as a sort of generalized standard of treatment to which, as we'll talk about later, the Americans were very interested in adhering themselves to.
Yeah, so this really sets up then the framework for starting the American Revolution, right? So this is the precedent, what you're talking about, what has been commonplace for at least the French, the English, the Europeans. So now we've got the American Revolution starting out, and we're starting to take prisoners. So can you start to describe, the treatment? How was prisoner administration conducted at the outset of the American Revolution?
Absolutely, I can. Yeah. And I'll just give some numbers maybe to sort of ground the listeners into the scale that we're dealing with here. Over the entire American Revolutionary War, the Americans are going to capture about 17,000 British and British allied prisoners. And so, if we compare that to, for example, the number of British casualties during the war, which is about 24,000, 1.2 thousand Hessians killed, about 6.3-ish disease deaths. I mean, that's a sizable number. It compares to these other things that we normally think about when we think about sort of the ravages of war or what's being lost in war. We think about casualties, but prisoners, they're being taken out of that fight as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's an important number to keep in mind. Those prisoners are largely going to be captured at your usual suspects. Trenton and Princeton is going to produce about 1,000 prisoners. The largest sort of major windfall of prisoners that the Americans capture in terms of the early years of the war is going to happen at Saratoga, with about 6,000 prisoners captured under General Burgoyne.
Wow.
The Southern campaign will produce a few prisoners, but it really is not our best campaign in terms of victory. So, places like Kings Mountain, Cowpens, we'll catch some prisoners, and certainly a lot of partisan activity will produce prisoners as well. And then Yorktown is our last sort of major moment where the Americans are capturing a lot of prisoners at one time, about 7,000. And those prisoners were held by the Patriots in detention centers that were spread across the colonies. Generally, detention centers were selected due to their distance from active fighting. So, for example, in 1775, you don't want to have a prisoner detention camp in Boston. Probably not the best of ideas because you're close to the fighting, and the purpose is to maybe hold on to them. And we talk a little bit more later about how that sort of contrasts with what I was just talking about with the priority of exchange. So those detention centers largely will be isolated in places like rural Massachusetts, New Jersey, a lot of mid-Atlantic states. Mm-hmm. We also do have some prisoner camps in Virginia that we can talk about when we talk about the Convention Army later. For the British, generally, we're going to see that they will capture a little bit more prisoners than we do. So, a historian whose work is really good on this, Edwin G. Burroughs, he estimates that the British captured about 25,000 Americans during the war. So previous estimates had maintained that it was more or less equal with the number that the Americans had captured, around 18,000. But Burroughs, and I also do tend to agree with him on this, he estimates that 18,000 number is actually better reflective of the number of men who ended up dying in British captivity, and that 25,000 is more reflective of the total number. Major windfalls for the British, major windfalls for the British happen, again, usual suspects. So the New York campaign is going to produce between 5,000 and 10,000 prisoners for the British. The Philadelphia campaign, the fall of Charleston, also we'll see a lot of Continental Army soldiers falling into British captivity. So the Southern theater proves a little bit more useful to them in that sense. And then to the other part of your question about sort of, treatment and maybe tying it into what I had mentioned earlier, we really do see just a change, a sea change from the previous example, because of course during the colonial period, as I said, there is this preference for rapid exchange, and there's a preference for sort of getting men back to where they ought to be and making sure everybody's paid and all these sorts of things. And this really changes during the Revolution. And I would say that the treatment of prisoners by both the British and the Americans is very much reflective of the political priorities of the two belligerents. So I alluded to this earlier, but for the Americans, the goal is very much to sort of walk the walk and talk the talk, if you will. I think a lot of scholars of the Revolution will agree with me when I say the Americans are striving towards European regularity in every sense of the word. And we think about Washington, bringing his experiences from the 7 Years' War, for example, and wanting to professionalize his army according to European standards, something that he, achieves in part through the intervention of people like the Baron von Steuben, but he's also reading prolifically in European treatises. And this really shines through in American prisoner administration as well, or at least the priorities that Congress and that Washington were articulating about how they wanted to see those 17,000 prisoners treated during the war. So when I say they wanted to adhere to European standards of civilized warfare, and I say that very intentionally, civilized is kind of this word that might raise red flags for some of the listeners, but I'm distinguishing. I'm not saying that, European belligerents were incapable of executing prisoners, even in the late early modern period. I think that certainly did happen, but it was reserved for certain types of war. And I'm building here on the work of Robert Carr, who has a really excellent article on this. It's called "Why Should You Be So Furious? The Violence of the Pequot War," and it talks about how can this sort of late early modern period or early modern Europe talk about having just war theory, and yet we see the violence committed by American settlers, for example, against the Pequot, or violence was committed by the British against the Irish or the Scottish who tried to rebel periodically throughout the 18th century. And he answers it very compellingly, I think, by saying that it's different types of warfare according to the British conception. It's like, if you're rebelling, you're not worthy of this civilized warfare. But if you're another legitimate belligerent like the French were during the 7 Years' War, then yes, we're going to exchange you very quickly, and we're going to adhere to this sort of unwritten set of rules that we started our podcast with. And so this is really something that I think is key to understanding the way that prisoners are treated during the war, is that for America, they are aspiring to be among those European powers. And so therefore, they will talk the talk and they will walk the walk. They will treat the prisoners according to these civilized standards of warfare. Now, from the British perspective, to treat American prisoners like legitimate combatants is to cede the question of American independency. To treat American prisoners according to the standards of civilized warfare is to say, we treat you as a belligerent as France was our enemy in the 7 Years' War. And to sort of, again, to give up the whole point of the war is to do that. And so we do see the British, at least, and sometimes their bark is louder than their bite during the war, but the British are not willing to treat American prisoners the way that they treated French prisoners during the 7 Years' War. They want to treat them just on the edges of humility, of humanity, in order to sort of punish the Americans for this rebellion and to try to get them to come back to the fold. And so that's the best way of sort of understanding the differing approaches. And this is why we get, and we'll eventually get here, but this is why we get to American prisoners being hosted in British prison ships in New York Harbor, right, with which we all have some sort of familiarity. And then the American treatment of British prisoners, which is far less, publicized. We know a lot less about it, but there's a lot of great scholarship going on about it right now, hopefully my own included. But this is why we see such a stark difference where Americans are keeping prisoners, in their communities. And it's not to say that British prisoners didn't suffer in American captivity. Sometimes they did. But was there a sort of systematic, intentional, almost punitive system in place that was very much reflective of this idea of, punish the rebels? No, there wasn't. So I do think that there's quite a difference there. So I can get into the administration a little bit more specifically, kind of building on that. But as I gestured at, the Americans had different detention centers, and the prisoners would be distributed across those centers based on how much capacity they had, essentially, how close they were to a particular battle, how close they were to the fighting at any given time. During the early years of the war, this is very ad hoc. Congress had a lot to do, as it turns out, and it wasn't really interested in dealing with, the prisoners that came out of the Canadian campaigns, for example. We take prisoners at Ticonderoga, we take prisoners at Fort St. John. But these aren't huge numbers of prisoners, and so the Congress is not really interested in articulating any sort of clear guidance on what to do with them. And so the colonists are more or less just sort of putting them where there's room, where there's space, and they're employing the prisoners, they're hiring them out, which, as I said earlier, did occasionally happen in the colonial period. It's not until 1777 that Congress, we've had Trenton and Princeton by this point. We have had a big windfall of prisoners, and Congress now says, okay, we need to kind of standardize this system. Congress creates something called the Department of Prisoners. This is very much at the urging of George Washington, who thinks that prisoner administration needs to be standardized again so that Americans can kind of walk the walk and talk the talk. He appoints Elias Boudinot, who's a New Jersey lawyer who had been very prominent in New Jersey revolutionary politics, to be the nation's first commissary general of prisoners. And he will have a series of deputies under him, and they're essentially going to come into this pre-existing system of prisoner administration and try to kind of take on their responsibilities of the sort of colonial authorities that had done it previously. The revolutionary provisional governments like committees of safety had really borne the brunt of prisoner administration in 1775. So Elias Boudinot and his deputies will come in and start to try to standardize prisoner administration a little bit.
Who was actually in charge of the prisoners? Modern day we've got military police. It's primarily their mission, but who would take responsibility for it?
Yeah, so this is one of the ways that it's actually very different from now, the way that prisoners are handled, because the Americans just simply did not have the sort of bureaucratic capacity to have people on prisoners a lot of the time. So a lot of the sort of policing of prisoners, if you will, within these host communities, as I call them in my work, came from the community itself. And so we think about people like sheriffs or militiamen or, justices of the peace. They're kind of taking on this additional role during the war to also now be making sure that prisoners are acting up, correctly within these communities. Boudinot ostensibly is the Commissary General of Prisoners. He's in charge, but he has to also wear the hat of not only dealing with the prisoners in the American interior, but Americans that are in British captivity. And as he finds out very quickly, that's a really big job. And he's very busy with that a lot of the time. His deputies, he has a deputy appointed to New England. He has a deputy that works in Pennsylvania. He has one for Virginia. But again, most of the time, it's just a very small infrastructure for what is a vastly overextended prisoner administrative system. And so the communities, even though the Department of Prisoners is established to sort of standardize prisoner administration, the communities actually are the ones that continue to have a lot of influence over what the prisoners are actually allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. There's a major detention center at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where most of the prisoners that the Americans capture at some point will go through Lancaster. There's another detention center in Frederick, Maryland. There's one in Rutland. And really administration is going to vary significantly across those camps and across different situations. Some places prisoners will be allowed to go out and work, though this is going to change throughout the war, especially those prisoners who have specialized skills. They'll be, contracted out to go and work. German prisoners generally across the board are seen as more trustworthy. So they'll be allowed, out of their barrack structures to go and worship, for example, or to participate in the local religious community. Particularly when we look at like the Moravian communities of Pennsylvania. So there's a good deal of sort of integration between prisoners and the communities where they've been sent to endure their captivity, because exchange is something that just really does not materialize in a significant way during the war until we get to about 1780. There's just like the British and the Americans are really just at loggerheads over this issue of exchange. The British don't want to do it. There's also intransigent on the part of the Congress as well, where Congress, for its own reasons, wants to sort of keep prisoners away from the British, doesn't want to give them back, is worried about strengthening the British by giving those prisoners back. So there's a lot of politics there, but, all while those exchange negotiations are sort of petering out, we still have Americans dying in the halls of British prison ships, and we still have British Allied prisoners.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. I think got a good understanding of how the Americans were running it, but what kind of situation were the American prisoners facing under the British?
Yeah, so the British kind of had a similar approach in the sense that they have one head honcho. His name is Joshua Loring, and he's the Commissary General of Military Prisoners. He's a loyalist actually, and he's appointed by General Howe. So he's kind of Boudinot's counterpart, if you will. The British, as I mentioned earlier, are mostly going to catch the majority of their prisoners during the New York campaign. And when we think about sort of just like the practicality of what the British had to confront in dealing with this problem of a huge number of prisoners, they didn't have if you want to keep prisoners stateside, so to speak, you have to capture that territory and have it locked down pretty tight. And so it's more difficult, that kind of I'm not apologizing for British prison hulks, far from it. They were terrible, but it kind of becomes easier to take these decommissioned ships and convert them to be more like barracks and then just keep prisoners in there. That not all prisoners went into prison hulks. Some of them were put into sugar houses and other sort of repurposed buildings in New York. Several different examples we can talk about there. Some of them did go to the municipal jails in regions where the British were dominant. Some of them were put in converted churches and things like this. It really just becomes a matter of where is their space, what can be converted, what can be used.
Were any sent back across the Atlantic?
Yeah, so some of them were sent back actually to Great Britain. There is evidence that the British may have even been sending prisoners to the West Indies to sort of work. Yeah, so I won't get too far into that because I'm not sure if I have enough research to fully explain the parameters of that, but I do have some evidence to suggest that they were put, all throughout the empire, not just back to England, but several prisoners went to Old Mill Prison, to Fortin Prison in Hampshire, the old Tower Prisoner in Liverpool. So some of them did go back, a lot of them did stay, and it's not that the British were neglecting them across the board. Again, similar to the American experience, it does come down to sort of necessity, to the amount of materials that are available, particularly when you're fighting, on extended lines, the way that the British were. But it's also very it's location specific. So where you are is going to really determine your experience in captivity for the American side of things among the British.
Yeah, because with my limited knowledge of this, the main thing that I'd always heard about was the prison ships and the terrible conditions in those. But, then we have to talk a little bit about the media, because, everyone's perception is really going to be influenced by the media. And so can you talk a little bit about the role of the media during this time period in shaping public perceptions of the treatment of POW? I don't know if they called them POWs then, but of prisoners during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And they did call them POWs, but I won't pontificate on that because that turns into a very long. They did call them prisoners of war. Just a real brief piece on that. It was to distinguish them from loyalist prisoners, at least on the part of the Americans. They wanted to make sure those groups were treated differently and separately. And just as one more aside to that, yes, loyalist prisoners were treated much worse than prisoners of war. So if you really want to get into examples of the Americans treating British in ways that were maybe comparable to the maltreatment that Americans endured in prison ships, and look at the American prison ships where we kept loyalist prisoners. But yeah, maybe a story for another time. The media is so important to understanding, this era, and the way that the media functioned was really important to public perception. So one thing that I'll note is that people would send letters to their families. And sometimes that was, just to tell their family, like, hi, I'm in the hull of the HMS Jersey, this is probably the most notorious British prison ship in New York Harbor. And just sort of updating them that way. But other times people would write intentionally, understanding that their family members would put those letters in the newspaper. And so people would hear about prisoners' experiences either through word of mouth from friends who knew people who were there, or family members who knew people that were imprisoned, or they would read about it in their newspapers. And this, of course, led to sort of widespread indignation and anger about what's going on with Americans in British captivity. Another thing that would occur, actually what got me into the study of the subject originally, as I had discussed earlier, the Department of Prisoners and the deputies of Elias Boudinot. And I read several postings in the Massachusetts Spy from 1778 from Joshua Mercer, who was the deputy commissary of prisoners under Boudinot. He served in New England administering prisoners. And he wrote about the sufferings of Americans in British captivity. And then he ended this, little diatribe that he has. He says, and you Americans are not patriotic enough if you're not willing to, help them, which is really interesting. So people either heard about it directly, or they heard about it through friends, or they maybe read things like that from the Department of Prisoners, which described the experiences of Americans in captivity. And this, of course, just, made people extremely angry. And then one other piece on this that I'll mention is that after the war, people also wrote prolifically about their experiences and published about their experiences. So we think about Ethan Allen, who was captured early in the war. He wrote his own captivity narrative when the war was done, and that was read, extensively. Germans who were prisoners in America sometimes would mention their captivity within their own memoirs that they would write. There's a really interesting story that I read when I was first getting into this by a Massachusetts boy. He was about 15 when he was taken. His name was John Blatchford, and he wrote about his captivity experiences. He's one of these American prisoners who claimed to have been sent to the West Indies during the East Indies. He claimed he went to Sumatra. I know, very interesting. He also says he fought a tiger. So maybe a little, I'm not sure about John Blatchford. But anyway, the point being that if you didn't read about it during the war, you read about it after the war, and it shaped not only perceptions of the British treatment of the Americans during the conflict, but also really, I think, has led to this enduring understanding that we all have of the British treated the Americans poorly, because we do have these captivity narratives that just continue to live on, that you can still read today.
Right, and nobody wants to read, oh yeah, I was a captive, but hey, everything was great. But what's going to get the people interested in is, yeah, I was a captive and it was horrible, and here's the conditions, and here's what they had to fight. It's much more dramatic, and so I think that's what's going to be more interesting to people to read.
Well, absolutely, yeah, and I'm far from it for me to suggest that any or even some of the captivity narratives that were published by Americans after the war were untrue or were fabricated in some way. But we have to always pay attention to publication dates, because if it's within a couple of years of a pension act, then maybe it has something to do, somewhat with proving valor, proving experience in order to get that compensation for it.
Mm-hmm.
People also, I think, people knew the history. It was even enduring in the early part of the 19th century. And so if you know the history, how much are you writing about your own experience, and how much are you sort of writing into a existing literary tradition?
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned earlier that Congress really got very serious about this, starting in 1777. Maybe it was after the Saratoga campaign, but how much of their new attention to this was inspired by these perceptions?
Hugely inspired. Yeah, hugely inspired. So when Congress establishes the Department of Prisoners, again, as I gestured at earlier, it's very much building on an existing system of prisoner administration, whereby, Americans had already been dealing with prisoners for several years. They had largely left their responsibility and decision-making related to prisoners to the sort of provisional wartime authorities, so things like committees of safety. And from this ad hoc situation of prisoner administration, a lot of things are allowed to happen. So prisoners are allowed to work. Prisoners are allowed out of their barracks during the day to kind of again, work for their subsistence, but then also sometimes just attend religious ceremonies, or they just had this greater degree of freedom. And when Oudinot is appointed, he doesn't come in swinging. He doesn't come in saying, I'm going to completely undo the system and standardize it, things like this. I mean, Washington is calling for a standardization, but nobody is explicitly saying, we need to stop letting the prisoners work, for example, or we need to stop letting the prisoners have this mobility in these communities. No one's really saying that until we get to, 1777, a little bit later in the war, because by this point, as we just discussed, sort of media has worked the way it's worked, and public opinion has worked the way it's worked, and there is outcry that the British have been treating American prisoners so poorly. We need to get revenge. We need to embark on a retributionary campaign against the prisoners that we have. And so Washington is a big proponent of this, and he says, not only do we need to stop these prisoners from laboring for their subsistence, we need to, if they kill one of our prisoners, we have to kill one of theirs. We need to do sort of an eye for eye approach. But this is something that's it proves very difficult for Elias Oudinot and his deputies to implement, because at this point, in a lot of cases, prisoners have been so integrated into communities in a variety of interpersonal and economic ways that they are facing resistance to them. And it's not, it's from Americans that are used to being able to control these prisoner populations. They don't want to cede that. And so I would say most obviously we see that transition in the example of the captivity of the Convention Army, which is the army that was captured under Burgoyne at Saratoga. This army in particular, I think, becomes the subject of different competing policies related to prisoner administration in the American interior, and certainly as a result sort of suffers for it.
Now during the administration of these prisoners, it must have taken a lot of forces to guard them. So to relieve that effect, did civilians or women actually play a role in the administration of prisoners for both sides? Absolutely,
they did. Yeah, and there's a lot of different things I can talk about this, but I'll limit myself to sort of like three main camps or groupings where we see women participating in this structure. So first of all, and anybody who's read Holly Mayer or who's read about camp followers during the war, I mean, that on both sides, the armies would have women following along with the army, working as sutlers or the family members of men. So when that army gets captured or some part of that army gets captured, women often were given the choice as to whether they wanted to join their husbands in captivity.
Interesting.
And
wow.
Yeah, it's interesting. And a lot of them did choose. I mean, to me, it's not much of a choice, because if you're in a, particularly if we're thinking about like British women, right? Like if you're in a foreign land and your husband or your father or your, whatever gets captured, what are you going to do if you choose not to go in captivity? You're in hostile territory. And So a lot of times they would choose to go. We see this in the example of the Ticonderoga prisoners. Actually, they pretty much go as like a unit down to their various places of confinement. But we also see it in the example of Frederica von Riedesel. So General Riedesel's wife will attend him in captivity as well. So those women, particularly are looking at like enlisted men's wives, they can serve as another source of labor for that family unit in a lot of cases, because during the colonial period, as I said, there's sort of this tradition of reimbursement after the war, and like, here's how much they cost, and so here you go. The British during the American Revolution are not even willing to exchange American prisoners, right? That's how unwilling they are to cede the question of American independence. So Congress isn't feeling wildly confident that Britain is going to take its like receipts for how much all these prisoners cost. And so Congress is worried about that, and let alone that it doesn't have the money itself to be able to pay for prisoners. The states are largely being asked by Congress to pay for these prisoners. And do the states want to do that? Of course not. Of course they don't want to do that. Nobody thinks that Britain is going to pay back the expenses the way that it did during the 7 Years' War, the French did during the 7 Years' War. So really the name of the game at that point for the Americans is like spend as little as possible. And, but again, they try to mitigate any suffering that might produce in prisoner populations by allowing them to labor for their subsistence. Okay. And so women were often, who had gone into captivity with their family members or acquaintances, what have you, they could work and they could supplement that income to be able to feed the family. If women, another, sort of example I can talk about is women who didn't choose to go into captivity or weren't captured, they weren't with the army when their husband got captured, they could advocate, and they did advocate for their captive husbands on both sides of it. So Susanna Papley, her husband was a loyalist, and he was captured. And I don't talk a lot about loyalists because I don't want to blend, too much over into that story. But I do think hers is an interesting sort of body of letters to read if you're interested in this topic more broadly, because she's just constantly writing to people like Elias Boudinot, and she's to his deputies and saying, my husband is being mistreated. You need to treat him better. She's asking for permission constantly to go and see him in captivity, to bring him food, all these sorts of things. So certainly like the familial, acquaintances or relations of men could and did help them in captivity. When we look at the example of Americans who were sent back to England, we see a sort of similar story where people who lived close by to like Fortin prison or to Old Tower, like women, would see the men like, out in the jail yard, or see them through the windows and feel badly for their plight and want to help them. And so there's, we get these really interesting letters and diaries from Americans who were sent to England who are talking about how like, a woman brought them bread, or a woman, brought them food. And so that's another example.
Yeah, it's the humanity.
Oh yeah. Hugely humanity. It's a similar example in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which I mentioned earlier as being a major detention site. Those Ticonderoga prisoners get there, and I mean, like, it's 1775. What do we do with you? I don't know. Like, your guess is as good as mine. And there's a fascinating little passage in the minutes of the Lancaster Committee of Safety where the chairman of the committee says, our community was so moved by the women and children of the Ticonderoga garrison that they started their own little charitable enterprise to kind of help these women and to give them food and to give them mattresses and things. And then just one more piece on the women part of things and how they were involved in a way that I think is very interesting is that in these host communities, there's also opportunities for commerce. And so periodically you see, between communities and inhabitants of these host communities and the prisoners, you see a good deal of sort of business happening. And so one example I can talk about is Rachel Still. She hosted the Trenton officers, or some of the officers who were taken at Trenton, in her boarding house in New Jersey. And so we see her being paid actually by Congress, one of the few instances where an American is going to be repaid by Congress for taking care of British or British allied prisoners. She is repaid for having those prisoners in her boarding house. And so there's plenty of opportunities for, women who are business oriented or who have their own, trades or goods that they're selling in revolutionary America. They will also have the opportunity to sort of interact with prisoner communities and sort of do business with them in that way.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about prisoner exchanges and that, the British didn't want to exchange prisoners, but After Saratoga, I think the Americans captured a lot of British. So did that remain the same, or did that influence the whole concept of prisoner exchange during the war?
Yeah, it absolutely did start to change things. And with the surrender at Saratoga, we see that the Americans kind of get a little bit like high on their own supply, almost like they're just so happy to have like all these prisoners under their command. And I think that T. Cole Jones, who wrote a great book about prisoner administration during the Revolutionary War, he talks about this. But, that body of prisoners ends up suffering a lot in captivity because Congress is again, has embarked on this sort of retributionary campaign or policy against British prisoners by this point. It says if they're going to treat us poorly, we're going to treat them poorly. And so they say that the Convention Army cannot be sent back to England, and they can't be exchanged, and they're sort of like made, not the exchanges are really happening anyway, but they say that basically this is going to be a distinct type of captive group, and they're going to just stay in captivity until like the end of the war. And so they're not eligible for exchange at all. And what ends up happening as a result of that is, let me back up a little bit. Basically, like, there's no general exchange that happens during the war to this point. Congress is never able to, through its negotiators and through the British negotiators, they're never able to like sit at a table and say, okay, like all mine for all yours. That never happens during the war. And so at least not till the end of it. So what's happening in the interim is, again, these states who have detention centers, they themselves are independently going like state actors, and they are doing very small scale exchanges to like redeem, like Massachusetts. We're going to go get Massachusetts men out of captivity with these British prisoners that are in this detention center in Rutland, Massachusetts. Pennsylvania starts doing this as well. We're going to go get Pennsylvanians out of captivity for these British prisoners that we have. So exchanges are happening, but they're not happening in large scale, and they're being affected by the states, not by Congress. And this is something that Washington is really resistant to, because he says this is destabilizing. This is not centralized. This is not standardized. The states, for all intents and purposes, are at this point, and you can say this about other elements of the war, but they're fighting their own mini revolutions. And prisoner exchanges where we're just going to go get Pennsylvanians or we're just going to go get Massachusetts men, like it's the same type of thing. It's a different manifestation of the same problem. But the Convention Army is going to be exempt from that. And they're kind of put aside as like a separate group. And so as they're going from state to state to state, from detention center to detention center, they're just kind of a burden on that community. Like, yes, they can and they do participate in the local economies. But by the time we get to 1780, 1781, this really robust practice of like small scale state exchanges is very much ongoing. And the conventioneers, as they're called, are exempt from that. They can't be involved in that. They're under much more direct military oversight, almost always attended by the Continental Army or overseen by the Continental Army. General William Heath actually is put in charge of their administration as, again, a separate captive group. And so this is really, I would argue, where we see Congress's attempt to get back at Great Britain, I guess, for the way that Britain's been treating its prisoners. This is where we see it most manifested in the struggles of the Convention Army. And the Convention Army will stay in captivity until the very end of the war. A lot of them will die in captivity. Again, T. Cole Jones is really great on this, but making them completely unexchangeable when the states have largely started to fill in that gap that Congress had left behind is what really dooms a lot of them to suffering in captivity, and for some of them even death in captivity. And to your question about when we do start to see larger scale exchanges happen, that really doesn't happen until Charleston, because it's not until Charleston that the British really have like a large number of prisoners.
And that's what, 1780 you're talking about?
Yeah. And
right. Yeah, towards the end of the war.
Exactly, yeah, because this is when Britain sort of, the pendulum swings back towards them in terms of having the favor of prisoners. So they can start to hit back against Congress, and that's when we will start to see, larger scale prisoner exchanges being achieved. And then, of course, at Yorktown and beyond is when we'll start to see the big movement occurring.
Yeah, and just, reading through history and watching movies, prisoner of war movies, there was always a distinction between how enlisted soldiers were treated and how officers were treated. Was there a difference here during the war?
Absolutely, yeah. So officers generally, again, sort of building on this late early modern tradition of martial civility, officers generally had more allowances than enlisted men did. And even as the Americans are kind of on a local level bucking international tradition and trying to kind of just largely follow the demands of pragmatism in terms of dealing with prisoners, this is still something that is, I would say, is so inherent in the culture that it doesn't go away completely. So officers do get something called parole, and this is something that transfers right from the colonial period into the Revolutionary War. If you're an officer, you will have a parole. This generally means that you can travel within a set period of time or within a more generally a set distance. So like 10 miles from this house, or, you can go during these hours of the day, you can be on your own, but you have to kind of check, you have to go back to your place of confinement at the end of the night. Also, just on that point about place of confinement, officers are going to be allowed to rent private accommodations, whereas enlisted men are going to be going to barracks or barrack structures or those converted buildings that we talked about earlier. An officer can rent a room in Rachel Still's boarding house in Trenton, for example, or an officer can, stay in the home of maybe even an enemy American, because it is this honor culture where, there's this civility that exists among the upper echelons of both armies, where they can have this sociability, they can have interactions with one another across the enemy line. And there is this expectation that on the word of a gentleman, on your honor, you're not going to defy your parole. You're not going to use your parole to leave. And so that's one way that officers are going to have sort of, I would say, more pleasant experiences of captivity. It's not true across the board, but it's true very generally. Also, they just have greater resources, personally, financially, that they can draw on to make their captivities more comfortable. They're not largely going to be seen resorting to sort of laboring for their subsistence the way that enlisted men will. And they won't have as strict confines on their movements as enlisted men do, for sure.
Right. And then, so just briefly, from the beginning of the war until the end of the war, lessons learned and all that, how did the administration of prisoners change over that time period?
Yeah. So as I said earlier with the state exchanges, I think that's probably the biggest change that happens from the start to the end of the war, is that the states are going to become very active independently of Congress and of congressional negotiations to try to get their own men out of captivity. Now, of course, if you're, one of Congress's own, for example, if you're Canadian, like, good luck, Canada's not coming for you, bud. Like, so it's certainly not always optimal. And Washington himself sees this. Washington has personal friends write him and say, my son is a prisoner on this ship. Can you get him off? And Washington will say no. He says that we need to standardize this system, and we need this to not be a situation where the states are coming in and you just have to be, if you're Massachusetts man, it's a Massachusetts vessel out, next to the boat, then lucky you, it's your lucky day. Washington doesn't want that. He wants it to be purely defined on, yes, rank. We have to do, officers first, or like if you're very high ranking, you're going to be prioritized. But generally, length of time in captivity should be the only determinant. There should not be state favoritism. This is something that Washington just absolutely rages against for the entirety of the war and just never gets Congress to get on board with. Congress, they are the governing body of a newly united colonies that's just overthrown and over-centralized authority. They don't want to take on that mantle themselves against the, authorities of the states. And so this is something that Congress really resists Washington on. Boudinot, for his part, is also extremely stressed about this, and he doesn't like the states intervening in what he sees as his purview. And eventually he will, really just become so tired of it and resign. And the subsequent commissary generals of prisoners who serve at the helm of the Department of Prisoners for the rest of the war are going to be mostly contented to sort of take Washington's direction as he's attempting to sort of militarize the establishment. So that's the way it changes on the American side of things. On the British side of things, as the war goes on, the writing is on the wall, particularly after the French alliance, that just continuing to treat the Americans like rebels and treating them poorly is not going to win the war. And there is a very good chance that they will win the war, and then lo and behold, they do. And so I will say that we see a softening of British policy just from that perspective, where it's no longer this sort of intentional neglect in order to try to carrot and stick the Americans out of their rebellion. I think that they do become political realists and understand that, negotiations have to be in good faith in order to get the men redeemed. And this does begin to happen with more regularity, of course, towards the end of the war as well.
Yeah. And then reflecting back on this, moving forward, post-Revolutionary War, how did the lessons learned from this conflict influence prisoner administration in the American Army, since then, or even today?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I've been thinking about it a lot. And what comes to my mind immediately is just the proximity goes away. I don't think that in our modern context, and of course, when you're looking at the American Revolution, you're looking at a war that's fought on American soil. And so the proximity is just sort of a natural byproduct of the theater. However, that being said, you and I talked about media earlier, and we talked about how, the media publicization of the prisoners' plight has a lot to do with forming public perception and then later informing policy downstream of that for the way the prisoners are treated, with Congress embarking on sort of a retribution policy campaign against British Allied prisoners. I think in our modern context, of course, there was a huge drawdown of forces at the end of the Revolutionary War, and then over the decades, over the centuries, we built it back up since then. But I don't think there is as much visibility, and I don't think there's as much awareness of the way that prisoners of war are treated. And I think that when the media does sort of breach that, and the media does get sort of the scoop, if you will, on Guantanamo or what have you, that's when we start to really see the outcry to the same level that we saw, obviously directed in a different direction. But people are interested in these things, and they do become vocal in their opposition. And so I think that proximity or visibility of prisoner administration is something that is very different from the modern versus in the historical context. Because in the historical context, Americans knew what was going on with Americans and with their own prisoners. The British, less awareness, I would say, just by virtue of the Atlantic Ocean. But still, there is this sort of media apparatus that is informing people of what's going on. And I do think we have a similar system now, but the difference is that there's not sort of intentional sort of censorship or attempt to obscure what's going on. And I think whenever that comes out, it results in the same sort of public outcry that we saw in the Revolutionary period. So certainly some parallels and some important departures as well.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Brynne. This has been very insightful. One of the things that I just don't normally think about, but one of the essential parts of fighting in any conflict is the taking of prisoners and then the care for them. So this has been great. Just going back to our very first war and seeing how it was done. But before we close, it's time for our segment called Huzzah Trivia. So is there some piece of Army trivia that you can share about prisoner administration during the Revolutionary War?
I can, yeah. So Benjamin Franklin, our favorite hound dog from the 18th century, he was in France during much of the war. He was a diplomat, and actually it was there that Ben Franklin started to get Americans out of prisons by issuing the first American passports. So that's how he got some of these prisoners home. So you asked earlier, Lee, about prisons in England, and there were prisons in England, and Ben Franklin knew about those prisons in England, and he knew that Congress was failing to effectuate a general exchange, and so he started this sort of like network almost of operatives in France and in England to go and get these men out and smuggle them out of jail. And he did that with some of them by giving them American passports that enabled them to travel more freely back to America. So the first American passports actually came as a byproduct of the story that we're talking about here today.
Wow, how fascinating. That's a great piece of trivia. Thank you so much, Brynne.
Thank you.
And for that, but then for all your insights today about the prisoners of war during the American Revolution. And if anyone wants to learn more about the American Revolution or learn more about Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, X, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.